The clink of silverware against china echoed through the softly lit restaurant, mixing with the low hum of other diners' conversations. I had chosen this place for its warmth, the kind of spot where you could linger over coffee and forget the world outside. It was supposed to be a treat. A rare night out with my son Michael, just the two of us, like old times. We were halfway through the meal when the conversation turned, as it so often had lately, toward money. He was talking about the rising cost of living, how everything felt expensive these days. I nodded, listening, swirling my tea. Then, with a casualness that made my stomach twist, he leaned back in his chair, looked me straight in the eye, and said, "Sell your jewelry if you want to eat here." For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. The words hung in the air like smoke bitter, impossible to ignore. I felt the blood drain from my face. He didn't laugh. He didn't smile. He just went back to cutting his steak, as if what he'd said was as ordinary as asking for more bread. I glanced down at my hands, at the gold ring I'd worn since my 25th wedding anniversary, at the delicate bracelet my late husband had given me on our last Christmas together. These weren't just trinkets. They were pieces of my life, memories wrapped in metal and stone. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. I reached for my purse, slowly, deliberately, not to open it, but to close it. My fingers rested on the clasp, and I realized I wasn't just closing it against this bill. I was closing it against years of small, cutting remarks, against the steady drip of entitlement that had turned generosity into expectation. I set my napkin on the table and met his eyes. My voice was calm, but each word landed with the weight of a promise. "No, Michael. Not tonight. Not ever again." The space between us seemed to grow wider. I could see a flicker of surprise, maybe even anger in his expression. But for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel small under his gaze. I didn't know it then, but that moment would change everything. Before we continue with the rest of the story, please comment where you're listening to this from. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. To understand why those words hit so hard, you have to know the years that led up to them. Michael wasn't always like this. In fact, when he was little, he had a sweetness that made me believe he'd grow into a man of kindness and gratitude. He was the boy who would pick dandelions from the yard and hand them to me like they were roses. The boy who once emptied his piggy bank to help me buy groceries during a tough month. I raised him mostly on my own after his father passed away. It wasn't easy. I took extra shifts at the library, sometimes skipping lunch, to make sure he had enough for a school trip or new shoes. There were nights I'd sit at the kitchen table, with bills spread out in front of me, feeling the weight of every dollar. But I never let him see the worst of my worry. I wanted his childhood to feel safe. When he went off to college, I helped however I could. I sold my late husband's old pickup to pay for his first semester's books. I dipped into my savings for his rent when he couldn't find a part-time job fast enough. At the time, it didn't feel like sacrifice. It felt like love. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. Maybe it was when Michael landed his first good job, and his lifestyle grew faster than his paycheck. Maybe it was when I started saying yes a little too easily whenever he hinted at needing money. Or maybe it was the year he went through his divorce and I covered his legal fees without question. The asks became more frequent, the tone more expectant. At first, it was little things. "Mom, can you help with the car repair?" Or, "Mom, I'm a bit short on rent this month." But then it turned into, "You should invest in this opportunity for me." Or, "You could just sell one of your gold pieces. You never wear them anyway." I'd laugh it off, but deep down it stung. Each comment chipped away at the trust and warmth we once shared. I began to wonder if he saw me as anything more than a safety net, a purse he could open whenever he wanted. One Thanksgiving, 2 years before that restaurant night, the cracks really showed. We were sitting at the table surrounded by family when Michael made a joke about how I had all that jewelry sitting in a box while he was out here trying to make ends meet. The laughter from a few cousins felt like knives in my back. I smiled to keep the peace, but something in me started hardening that day. Still, I kept giving. Part of it was habit. Part of it was fear. Fear that if I stopped helping, I'd lose him. Fear that money was the glue holding our relationship together. And for a while, it was easier to just keep saying yes than to face the possibility that my son's affection might be conditional. But those little humiliations added up. I stopped inviting him to certain events because I didn't want to be cornered about finances in front of others. I started locking away my more sentimental jewelry, not because I thought he'd steal it, but because I didn't want to see it become a bargaining chip in another conversation. By the time we met at that restaurant, I was already carrying years of unspoken hurt. And when he said those words, "Sell your jewelry if you want to eat here," it wasn't just about dinner. It was about every small betrayal, every laugh at my expense, every moment I'd felt like my value to him was measured in gold and silver. And that night, I decided the price had finally become too high. That night at the restaurant wasn't supposed to be a battlefield. It was meant to be a small celebration. Something warm. Something good. It was early autumn, one of those crisp evenings when the air smells faintly of wood smoke and the leaves glow in shades of gold and deep red. I had been looking forward to it all week. Michael had called me the Friday before, his voice unusually cheerful. "Mom," he'd said, "let's go out next week. Just you and me. My treat." I remember smiling at those words. My treat. They were rare, and I wanted to believe them. It had been so long since we'd spent an evening together without some undercurrent of stress or tension. I imagined us talking about light-hearted things, the kind of conversations we used to have when he was younger and still called me for advice on recipes or laundry. The restaurant was one of my favorites. A little family-owned place tucked into the corner of an old brick building downtown. Its windows glowed softly in the dark, and when you stepped inside, you were greeted by the scent of rosemary bread and the sound of quiet jazz. The kind of place where you could lean in close and really talk. I even put on a necklace I hadn't worn in years, a modest gold chain with a tiny locket, inside of which was a picture of Michael as a boy, gap-toothed and grinning. I didn't think of it as showing off, just keeping a piece of our history close. When we sat down, the atmosphere felt right. The waitress brought warm bread, the wine glasses caught the light, and for the first half hour, things were easy. Michael told me about his latest project at work. I shared updates about my garden, how the roses had bloomed longer than expected this year. We laughed a little. I thought, maybe we've turned a corner, but then the conversation shifted. It started subtly, the way it always did, a comment about how expensive the city had become, how people like me had to get creative to make ends meet. I knew where it was headed, but I tried to steer us elsewhere. I asked about his friends, his plans for the holidays. He didn't follow. Instead, he leaned back, studied me for a moment, and his gaze drifted to the necklace. That's when the words came. Blunt. Uninvited. "Sell your jewelry if you want to eat here." Andy. It was almost absurd in its cruelty, especially after he had been the one to suggest dinner. My mind spun. Was this some sort of test? A joke gone wrong? Or had he planned the evening just to make this point? I remember my fingers tightening around my napkin. Around us, other diners kept chatting. Waiters moved between tables with steaming plates, and a soft piano played near the bar. But for me, the air had gone thin. The walls seemed closer. I knew then that this night, the one I had imagined would be a bridge, was about to become a line in the sand. I just want to check if you're still listening. If so, please type a 1 inch the comments. And if you feel a connection to my story, I'd be so grateful if you would like this video. Subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell to stay updated. I sat there for a long second after Michael's words, letting the noise of the restaurant fade into a dull hum. I didn't want to react in anger, not because he didn't deserve it, but because I wanted this moment to matter. He was already reaching for the wine glass, his eyes back on his plate as though the conversation had ended. But for me, it had only just begun. I reached slowly for my purse, the same one I'd carried for years, a deep burgundy leather bag with a sturdy clasp. My fingers found the metal latch, and instead of opening it like I had done 100 times before for him, I pressed it shut with a quiet click. That sound, small as it was, felt louder than the clinking of glasses or the murmur of nearby conversations. He noticed. His fork paused halfway to his mouth. "What are you doing?" I met his eyes. "I'm closing my purse, Michael." A small frown formed between his brows. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said evenly, "that tonight, I'm not paying for anything. Not the bill, not the drinks, not the quiet little digs you've been making for years." His mouth tightened. "You're overreacting." It was just a comment. "No," I said, my voice calm, but firm. It was a comment layered on years of other comments. It was a reminder that you've started looking at me as a wallet, not a mother. And I'm done letting you do it. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "So that's it? You're going to embarrass me in public?" I shook my head. "No, Michael. You've embarrassed yourself. All I'm doing is drawing the line." The waitress appeared at that moment with a warm smile, setting down our plates. She didn't notice the frost in the air between us, but Michael did. He picked up his fork again, as though pretending nothing had happened would undo the moment. But I could feel the shift. Something had broken, or maybe something had finally healed. The invisible thread that had kept me tied to every one of his demands had snapped, and I felt lighter for it. I took a slow breath, opened my napkin, and began eating. Not because I was ignoring him, but because I refused to let his words ruin the meal I had come here to enjoy. We ate mostly in silence after that. He kept glancing at me, perhaps expecting me to soften, to laugh it off, to reopen the purse. But I didn't. My hand stayed on the table, far from that clasp. When the bill finally came, I nudged it toward him without a word. He hesitated for a beat, then pulled out his own card. The sound of the leather wallet opening was sharp in my ears, and in that instant, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard it in my presence. It was such a small victory, but it felt monumental. And yet, I knew this was just the start. Drawing a line was one thing. Keeping it would be another battle entirely. The night air hit us as soon as we stepped outside. Crisp and cool, with that faint scent of fallen leaves that always comes in early autumn. The restaurant's warm glow spilled out onto the sidewalk. But once we moved past its windows, the world felt dimmer, quieter, except for the distant hum of traffic. Michael walked a half step ahead of me, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets. He didn't look back, didn't offer his arm, didn't even try to make small talk. The silence between us was thick, almost physical, like walking through fog. I clutched my purse against my side, not out of fear, but as a reminder of the moment I'd claimed it for myself again. My heels clicked against the pavement, each step steady, measured. When we reached the corner where our cars were parked, he finally turned to me. His jaw was tight, his eyes sharp in the glow of the street lamp. "You didn't have to make a scene," he said. I kept my voice calm. "I didn't make a scene, Michael. I simply said no." His laugh was short and humorless. "You're acting like I'm some sort of stranger trying to take advantage of you." I tilted my head. Are you saying you haven't been? That stopped him. For a moment, he just stared at me, as if weighing whether to argue or walk away. His mouth opened, then shut again. He looked down at the sidewalk instead. I was just joking, he muttered. No, I said, shaking my head. You were testing me. And now you know the answer. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his breath visible in the cool air. So, that's it? One dinner, and suddenly you're… What? Cutting me off? I thought about that for a moment. Not cutting you off, I said. Setting boundaries. There's a difference. And if you can't tell the difference, then maybe you've been leaning on me too much. His lips pressed into a thin line. You've changed, he said, almost accusingly. I smiled faintly, though there was no joy in it. No, Michael. I've just stopped pretending I haven't noticed. We stood there for a beat longer, the sounds of the city moving around us. A car horn in the distance. The muffled chatter of people passing by. It felt like a crossroads. Not just physically, but in our relationship. Finally, he gave a short nod, almost to himself, and stepped toward his car. Good night, Mom. Good night, Michael, I replied. My voice was steady, but inside, my heart was a swirl of emotions. Sadness, relief, and a cautious hope that maybe this was the first step towards something better. I watched his taillights fade into the night before unlocking my own car. As I slid into the driver's seat, I sat for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. This wasn't the ending of something. Not yet. It was a reckoning, the kind that forces you to decide how much of yourself you're willing to keep giving away before there's nothing left. And for the first time in a long while, I knew my answer. When I got home that night, the house felt colder than usual. It wasn't the temperature the thermostat glowed at a steady 70 degrees, but the kind of cold that seeps into you from the inside. A chill, born from the things left unsaid. I set my purse down on the entryway table, its clasp still closed tight, and stood there for a moment, in the dim light. My reflection stared back at me from the hallway mirror, hair slightly mussed from the wind, necklace still around my neck, eyes tired but different. There was a steadiness there I hadn't seen in a while. In the kitchen, I filled the kettle and set it on the stove. The familiar whistle a few minutes later felt like a small comfort, a reminder that some things, unlike people, still did exactly what they promised. I poured the hot water over a tea bag, watching the dark tendrils of color curl through the cup. As I sipped, my mind replayed the evening in fragments, the warmth I'd felt when Michael first invited me, the shift in his eyes when he looked at my necklace, the sharpness of his words, and the quiet finality of me closing my purse. It wasn't just about dinner. It never had been. This was about years of letting small indignities slide, of giving too much without asking for respect in return. I wandered into the living room, settling into my favorite chair, the one with the soft, worn arms, where I'd read countless books over the years. The ticking of the wall clock was the only sound in the room, each second passing like a metronome for my thoughts. Part of me ached. Michael was my son. No matter how grown he was, no matter how much he hurt me tonight, a piece of me still wanted to smooth things over, to call him and make it right. That maternal instinct is stubborn. It clings even when your rational mind tells you to step back. But another part of me, the part that had been quiet for too long, felt a new sense of strength. For years, I'd thought that love meant sacrifice without question, that the only way to keep my family close was to give and give and give again. Tonight, I realized that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's a slow erasure of yourself. I thought about the way he looked at me after I slid the bill toward him, the flash of surprise, almost disbelief, as if it had never crossed his mind that I might say no. That moment told me more than words ever could. He had grown comfortable, maybe too comfortable, assuming my purse would always be open. My tea had gone lukewarm by the time I stood and walked to the small desk in the corner of the room. I opened the top drawer and pulled out a notebook, the one where I kept lists of things I needed to do, thoughts I didn't want to lose. On a fresh page, I wrote in bold, deliberate letters, "Boundaries with Michael." Underneath, I began to write, letting the words spill out in steady, deliberate strokes. I promised myself I would no longer cover his expenses without talking about it first. I would never sell or give away anything sentimental just to meet his requests. If he made a joke about money at my expense, I would address it in the moment instead of swallowing it in silence. And from now on, we would meet on neutral terms. No more invitations where the unspoken expectation was that I would be the one to pay. The list wasn't long, but it was a start, and writing it down made it feel real, like a promise to myself. I closed the notebook, returned it to the drawer, and took my teacup to the sink. The house was still quiet, but it didn't feel quite so cold anymore. I knew the days ahead might be awkward, tense, but I also knew I wouldn't go back. That night, as I turned out the lights and climbed into bed, I realized something important. I didn't just close my purse at the restaurant. I'd closed the chapter of letting myself be undervalued, and that was worth far more than anything inside it. I just want to check if you're still listening. If so, please type a 1-inch the comments. And if you feel a connection to my story, I'd be so grateful if you would like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell to stay updated. The next morning, the phone rang just as I was finishing my coffee. The sunlight was streaming through the curtains, soft and golden, making the kitchen feel warmer than it really was. I glanced at the caller ID, Michael. A part of me hesitated, my fingers hovering over the receiver. My resolve from last night was still fresh, but so was the ache in my chest. I answered anyway. "Hello? Mom?" His voice came. Casual. Almost too casual. "I've been thinking about what happened yesterday." My heart picked up. Maybe he was calling to apologize. Maybe he realized how cruel those words had been, telling me to sell my jewelry if I wanted to eat at my own son's table. I clung to the hope that there might still be a bridge to mend. "I didn't mean to upset you," he said, and for a brief second I felt relief. But then he added, "It's just, times are hard for everyone. You know how it is." I could hear something in the background, the faint clink of dishes, the hum of voices. He was somewhere busy, not fully focused on this conversation. And it struck me. I was an errand on his list, something to tick off before moving on with his day. "I understand times are hard," I replied softly. "But there's a difference between hard times and disrespect." He sighed. "Mom, you're taking it the wrong way. I was just joking." Joking. That word felt like sandpaper against my skin. People who love you don't joke about your worth, your dignity, or the things you've spent a lifetime cherishing. "I'm not laughing, Michael," I said. My voice was steady now, calm in a way that carried more weight than shouting ever could. "And I don't think I can keep pretending everything is fine when it isn't." There was a pause. A real pause. The kind that stretches just long enough to make you wonder if the line has gone dead. Then he cleared his throat. "Well, I guess I'll talk to you later." He hung up before I could respond. I sat there, with the phone still in my hand, listening to the silence. The warmth in the kitchen suddenly felt thinner. The light, not as soft. I looked at the list I'd written the night before. The ink was still crisp, the words firm. And I realized this wasn't just a list, it was a boundary. It was me reclaiming something I hadn't even noticed I'd lost. For the rest of the day, I stayed busy. I watered the garden, baked a small loaf of bread, sorted through old letters. But underneath it all, there was a quiet, persistent voice reminding me, you deserve better. That evening, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window. I thought about all the years I'd given the sleepless nights, the scraped knees I'd kissed, the birthday cakes baked from scratch. None of it had been for gratitude, but for love. And yet, love should never demand you trade your pride for a seat at the table. I knew then that this was not going to be an easy road. Standing up for myself would mean uncomfortable conversations, maybe even distance. But I also knew that the alternative, shrinking smaller and smaller to fit someone else's convenience, was no longer an option. When I went to bed that night, the list was still on the kitchen table. I didn't put it away. I wanted to see it in the morning. A reminder that I had drawn a line. And this time, I intended to keep it. 2 weeks later, the phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Michael. It was my sister, Elaine. Her voice was full of warmth, the kind that instantly reminded me of childhood summers and late-night talks under the covers. We're having a little get-together this Sunday, she said. Nothing fancy, just family. You should come. Michael will be there too. Her words sat in the air like an unspoken test. Did I want to be in the same room with him so soon? A part of me bristled at the idea, but another part, well, it wanted to see if the lines I'd drawn would hold up in public. Sunday came with a crisp chill in the air. I chose my clothes carefully, a soft navy sweater and the pearl necklace my mother had left me. It wasn't just jewelry. It was history, a reminder of where I came from, and the people who'd taught me my worth long before I had to defend it. Elaine's house was glowing with laughter when I arrived. The smell of roasted chicken and fresh bread wrapped around me the moment I stepped in. I could hear the hum of overlapping conversations from the dining room. And there he was. Michael stood near the buffet table, a glass of wine in hand, laughing at something our cousin had said. He looked relaxed, maybe even happy. For a moment, I just watched him, trying to remember the boy who used to run to me after school, cheeks flushed from the playground, pockets full of little treasures to show me. When he noticed me, his smile faltered, not entirely gone, but dimmed. "Hi, Mom," he said, his tone cautious. "Hello, Michael." I kept my voice warm but steady. We made small talk at first, circling the safer topics. Work, the weather, Aunt Lily's new puppy. But eventually, the conversation drifted toward the past few weeks. "I've been thinking about what you said," he admitted, eyes flicking down to the plate in his hands. "About boundaries." I nodded, letting him take the lead. "I guess I didn't realize how much I'd come to expect from you," he continued. "And maybe I crossed a line." It wasn't a full apology, but it was the closest I'd heard in a long time. And I could tell it cost him something to say it in a room full of family, where pride often speaks louder than humility. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied. "I'm not asking for anything more than respect, Michael. That's all." Before he could answer, Elaine called us to the table. Everyone began finding their seats, laughter and clinking glasses filling the air. I found myself seated across from Michael. And though we didn't speak much during the meal, there was no tension, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted. At one point, Elaine passed around a basket of bread. Michael reached for it and, almost without thinking, placed a piece on my plate before taking his own. It was such a small gesture, but it spoke louder than anything else that day. As the afternoon wound down, people began saying their goodbyes. Michael walked me to the door. "I'll call you this week," he said, And for once, I believed him. Driving home, I realized something important. Setting boundaries hadn't pushed him away. It had drawn a clearer path for us to meet as equals. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like we were walking it side by side, not one carrying the other. I parked the car, stepped inside my quiet house, and hung my coat. The pearl necklace still rested against my collarbone, cool and reassuring, and I knew, deep down, that this was the kind of wealth no one could ever ask me to sell. It was 3 weeks after the family gathering when the next call came. I was in the garden, kneeling beside the hydrangeas, coaxing dead leaves from their stems, when the phone buzzed in my pocket. Michael's name lit up the screen. I hesitated for only a second before answering. "Hi, Mom," he said, his tone lighter than it had been in months. "How are you?" "I'm well," I replied, brushing soil from my gloves. "And you?" We exchanged the usual pleasantries, the weather, work updates, a story about a neighbor's dog. I began to think this was just a casual check-in, and I felt a small relief at how normal it seemed. But then his voice shifted. "So, I was wondering if you might be able to help me out with something." My shoulders tensed. "Help you with what?" He hesitated, not the confident pause of someone delivering bad news, but the awkward gap of someone testing the ground before stepping forward. "It's nothing big. I've been looking at a new apartment, closer to work, nicer neighborhood. But, well, the deposit is a little more than I've got on hand right now." There it was. The test. The moment to see if the words I'd spoken, the list I'd written, were going to mean anything, when money was once again on the table. "I see," I said slowly, pulling off my gloves. "And you were hoping I could cover the deposit?" "It's just temporary," he said quickly. "I'd pay you back in a couple of months, maybe even sooner. You know I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important." I took a breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle on my chest. There was a time I would have agreed, before he even finished asking. But I remembered the night at the restaurant, the cold sting of his words, and the quiet conviction I'd felt when I closed my purse. "Michael," I began gently, "I understand you want this apartment, but I can't step in financially like I used to. I've decided that helping you has to mean more than just writing a check. If you want, I can help you budget, look for a place with a smaller deposit, or even negotiate with the landlord. But I can't give you the money." The silence on the other end was long enough for me to hear the faint rustle of wind through the hydrangeas. "So that's it?" he finally said, his voice cooler now. "That's it," I replied. "I love you, but my support can't come at the cost of my own boundaries." Another pause, then a quiet, "Okay, I guess I'll figure it out." After we hung up, I stood there for a moment, phone still in my hand, the late afternoon sun warm on my shoulders. I knew he might be frustrated, maybe even hurt. But I also knew that if I gave in this time, the old pattern would slip back in like an uninvited guest. That night, I made myself a simple dinner and ate by the window, watching the last light fade from the sky. Somewhere inside me, the ache of saying no was balanced by the steadiness of keeping my word, not just to him, but to myself. I just want to check if you're still listening. If so, please type a 1-inch the comments. And if you feel a connection to my story, I'd be so grateful if you would like this video. Subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell to stay updated. The next few days were quiet, too quiet. Michael didn't call, and I didn't reach out either. At first, I told myself he was just busy, sorting things out with the apartment. But by the end of the week, that familiar knot of worry had started to form in my stomach. On Saturday morning, I decided to stop by the farmer's market. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of baked bread and fresh apples. I wandered between stalls, greeting familiar faces, letting the bustle distract me from the uneasy silence between my son and me. That's when I saw Elaine. She waved, holding a basket of pears, but her smile looked a little forced. "Have you talked to Michael lately?" she asked after we exchanged hellos. "Not since earlier this week," I replied, tucking a loaf of bread into my bag. "Why?" She hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one was listening. "I think he's upset about the apartment. He mentioned it to a few people. Said you wouldn't help him, even though you could." Her words stung, not because they were surprising, but because I knew how they would sound coming from his mouth. In our small circle of friends and family, it would paint me as cold, maybe even selfish, the kind of mother who turned her back when her son needed her. I walked home from the market with the weight of that image pressing on me. Part of me wanted to call him right away, to defend myself, to explain why I'd made the decision I had. But another part, the part that had been quietly growing stronger these past weeks, told me to wait. That evening, I sat with a cup of tea, staring out at the garden. The hydrangeas swayed gently in the breeze, their colors fading into winter's muted palette. I thought about all the times I had jumped in to save him before he even asked, the way I had worn my own security thin to keep his comfort intact. Maybe this was the consequence, not just his silence, but the possibility that he might turn others against me. Still, I knew I couldn't go back to the old way. Protecting my dignity meant accepting that some people, even family, might not understand. On Monday, the phone finally rang. Michael's name again. My heart thudded as I answered. "Hi, Mom." His voice was measured, almost too calm. "I found a place. Smaller than I wanted. But it'll do." "I'm glad to hear that," I said, and I meant it. He paused. "Look, I might have said a few things about you to people. Things I shouldn't have. I was angry." I took a slow breath. "I appreciate you telling me that, Michael. I'm still not happy you wouldn't help," he admitted. "But I get it. Sort of. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a crack in the wall. And for now, that was enough." After we hung up, I looked at the list still pinned to my fridge. The ink had begun to fade slightly, but the words were as clear as the day I wrote them. Boundaries, I reminded myself, aren't about punishment. They're about respect. And sometimes, respect takes longer to grow than love. The holidays have a way of magnifying everything: the joy, the nostalgia, and unfortunately, the tension. That year, Elaine decided to host Christmas dinner at her place. And as always, the entire family was invited. I hadn't seen Michael in person since our brief phone call about the apartment, and I wasn't sure what to expect. Snow fell in lazy spirals the evening I arrived, dusting the driveway in a thin, glittering layer. Elaine's home glowed from the inside out, the windows framed with twinkling lights. As soon as I stepped in, the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon hit me, wrapping me in warmth that felt both comforting and a little bittersweet. The living room buzzed with chatter. Children tore through the hall with candy canes in hand. Aunts swapped recipes in the kitchen, and near the fireplace stood Michael, glass of wine in hand, surrounded by a small circle of cousins. He was telling a story, his voice animated, his hands moving in wide arcs. I hesitated in the doorway, watching. Then he spotted me. For a second, his expression was unreadable, but then he smiled, polite but distant. "Mom," he said with a nod. "Michael," I replied, matching his tone. Dinner was a long, crowded table set with crystal glasses and holiday china. I ended up seated 3 places down from Michael, close enough to hear his voice, but far enough that we could both pretend we were too occupied with our immediate neighbors to talk directly. The conversation flowed around us. Politics, family updates, vacation plans. Then, somewhere between the mashed potatoes and the cranberry sauce, the topic shifted to housing. One cousin was talking about her new condo when Michael chimed in. Yeah, finding a place is tough, especially when the people who could help you choose not to. The table went quiet for a beat. I felt every eye flick toward me, subtle but sharp. Elaine, bless her, tried to steer the conversation back to safer waters, but Michael wasn't done. I mean, some people think teaching you a lesson is more important than helping family. Even at Christmas, I set my fork down. My heart was pounding, but my voice came out steady. Michael, I said softly, this isn't the time or the place. And he gave a tight smile. Maybe not. But the truth doesn't really have a calendar, does it? The silence that followed was heavier this time. I could see Elaine shifting uncomfortably, the younger cousins staring at their plates. I took a slow breath and chose my words carefully. I've always been there for you, I said, keeping my gaze on him. But being there doesn't always mean giving money. Sometimes it means giving you the chance to stand on your own. That's not punishment. It's love. For a moment no one spoke. Then my nephew cleared his throat, murmuring something about dessert, and the spell broke. Plates clinked, chairs scraped back, and the room filled with movement again. But the air between Michael and me stayed tense. I didn't regret saying it. Not for a second, but I knew the rift had just widened in front of the whole family. As I helped Elaine clear the dishes later, she leaned close and whispered, "You held your ground. That matters." And it did. Even if it hurt, even if it left the evening colder than the snow outside, it mattered. The morning after Christmas, I woke to a light frost on the windows and a heaviness in my chest. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that invites reflection, whether you want it or not. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table. The events of the night before looping in my mind. It hadn't been an explosion, but it was loud enough in its own way. Michael's words, the subtle shift in the room, the weight of everyone's eyes, they had all left an imprint. I knew family gatherings had their share of unspoken tensions, but last night had pushed ours into the open, and there was no stuffing it back into the shadows. By mid-morning, the calls started. First Elaine, checking in to see how I was doing, but also trying to gauge the damage. "You did the right thing," she said firmly. "Even if he doesn't see it now, one day he will." Then came a call from my sister, who had been at the far end of the table. "I think you embarrassed him," she said. Not unkindly, but with that frank tone only siblings can get away with. Not that he didn't bring it on himself, but you know how pride works. I did know. And I knew Michael's pride was a fragile thing, easily bruised and slow to heal. But I also knew that coddling it had been part of the problem for years. That afternoon, I decided to go for a walk. The streets were lined with bare trees dusted in snow, the air crisp enough to sting my cheeks. I passed the little bakery where Michael and I used to stop for pastries when he was a boy. And for a moment, I saw him as he had been small, eager, his hand slipping into mine without hesitation. The memory was bittersweet, a reminder that somewhere along the way, the simplicity between us had been replaced with something heavier. When I returned home, there was a message waiting on my answering machine. Michael's voice, clipped and controlled. "I think we should take some time. I'll call you when I'm ready to talk." I stood there, staring at the machine as if it might offer more than just those few seconds of his voice. The part of me that still wanted to smooth things over almost reached for the phone. But I didn't. Not this time. That evening, I took the list from the fridge, the one I'd written weeks ago, and read it again. The ink was beginning to fade, but the meaning was sharper than ever. Boundaries weren't meant to punish, they were meant to protect. And in this season of my life, I was learning that protecting my own peace was just as important as protecting the people I loved. I didn't know how long Michael's silence would last, or what shape our relationship would take in the months ahead. But I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't go back to the old patterns, no matter how tempting it might be in moments of loneliness. The snow outside thickened as night fell, covering the world in a quiet, unbroken white. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe. I just want to check if you're still listening. If so, please type a 1-inch the comments. And if you feel a connection to my story, I'd be so grateful if you would like this video. Subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell to stay updated. It had been nearly a month since Michael's last message. The days had settled into a calm, if somewhat lonely rhythm morning coffee by the kitchen window, tending to the garden even in the cold, occasional lunches with friends. I told myself I wasn't counting the days since I'd heard from him, but the truth was, I was. Then one Thursday afternoon, I found an envelope in my mailbox with Michael's handwriting on the front. It wasn't thick, just a single sheet inside, but seeing his name written in that familiar scrawl made my hands pause mid-motion. I stood in the driveway for a long moment, the winter air biting at my fingers, before finally breaking the seal. The letter was short. Mom, I've been thinking a lot about what happened. I'm still not sure I agree with you, but I understand you were doing what you thought was best. I didn't realize how much I was relying on you until you said no. It hurt, but maybe I needed to hear it. I'm sorry for what I said at Christmas. I shouldn't have done that in front of everyone. Mikael. I read it twice, then a third time. It wasn't a grand apology or a full reconciliation, but it was a crack in the ice. And after weeks of silence, that crack felt like a river breaking free. That night, I sat at my desk with a blank sheet of paper in front of me. I didn't want to rush my response, so I let the pen hover while I thought about what mattered most. I didn't want to lecture, and I didn't want to reopen wounds. Finally, I wrote, Michael, thank you for your letter. It means a lot to know you've been thinking about it. I know it wasn't easy for either of us, but sometimes love has to take the shape of limits. I've always believed in you, even when I've stepped back. I'm here when you're ready. Not as a bank, but as your mother. Love. Mom. I mailed it the next morning. A week later, he called. The conversation was tentative, like we were both testing a bridge that had been rebuilt plank by plank. But there was laughter, two small, unforced moments that reminded me of how things used to be. We didn't solve everything that night, but we began to talk again. And maybe that was enough for now. It was early spring when Michael suggested we meet in person. The snow had melted into soft patches along the sidewalks, and the first buds of tulips were starting to push through the soil. His voice on the phone was cautious but warmer than it had been in months. How about I come by on Sunday? I can bring lunch, he said. I agreed, though my stomach tightened with a mix of hope and apprehension. This would be the first time we'd sat across from each other since that tense Christmas dinner, and I wasn't sure how the air between us would feel. On Sunday morning, I busied myself around the house. I set out fresh flowers on the dining table, dusted the bookshelf, and even put on the kettle in case he wanted tea. It wasn't about impressing him. It was about creating a space that felt open, a silent invitation to let go of some of the heaviness we'd both been carrying. Just after noon, I heard his car pull into the driveway. My pulse quickened. When I opened the door, there he was holding a brown paper bag with a bakery logo on it. Thought you might like some of those almond croissants you love, he said, offering a small smile. We hugged, and it felt real, not strained, not guarded. Just a simple embrace between mother and sun. Inside, we unpacked lunch, quiche, salad, and the croissants, and settled at the table. The conversation began with safe topics: the weather, a movie he'd seen recently, a recipe I'd tried. But gradually, it edged closer to the heart of why we were here. "I've been thinking a lot," Michael said, swirling his fork through the salad, "about money and how I've always just assumed you'd be there to help if I needed it." I nodded, letting him continue. "It's not that I expected it in a greedy way," he added quickly, "but I think I got comfortable. Too comfortable. And when you said no, it felt like you were pulling away. But now, I get that maybe you were trying to, I don't know, make sure I could stand on my own." Hearing him say it out loud sent a wave of relief through me. "That's exactly it," I said softly. "It wasn't about loving you less. It was about loving you enough to let you figure it out yourself." He leaned back in his chair, sighing. "It's hard, Mom, but I guess I needed it." We talked for hours, weaving between light moments and heavier truths. He told me about the new apartment, smaller than he wanted but cozy. He'd even started cooking more, something I'd never seen him do before. At one point, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small box. "This is for you," he said, sliding it across the table. Inside was a delicate silver locket with a tiny photo of the two of us from years ago, me holding his hand at the beach when he was maybe 6 years old. "I wanted to remind you," he said, his voice catching just a little, "that no matter how stubborn I get, you're still my priority." I closed the locket in my palm, feeling the weight of it not in grams, but in meaning. "Thank you, Michael," I whispered. When he left later that afternoon, the air felt different, lighter. There was still work to do, conversations to be had, trust to rebuild. But for the first time in a long while, I believed we'd get there. Sometimes reconciliation doesn't come in grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes it arrives quietly, over quiche and almond croissants, in the steady rebuilding of something you thought might have been lost. The weeks after Michael's visit passed with a gentler rhythm. Our phone calls became more frequent, not out of obligation but genuine interest. Sometimes he'd call just to tell me about a new recipe he'd tried, or a funny moment at work. Other times, we'd talk about more personal things: his hopes, his fears, and even some of the mistakes he'd been reflecting on. One Saturday morning, I received a text from him. "Can you meet me for coffee? My treat." It might sound like nothing to someone else, but for me, it felt like a shift in the wind. I had been the one extending most of the invitations over the years, often footing the bill without a second thought. This was different. This was him reaching out, him taking the lead. We met at a small cafe near the park. The air smelled faintly of roasted beans and cinnamon, and sunlight streamed through the big front window, casting a golden glow on the wooden tables. Michael was already there, sipping from a steaming mug and waving me over with a smile that reached his eyes. "I've been thinking about how we do this," he began once I'd settled in with my tea. "You know, the whole parent and adult-child relationship. I don't want it to be lopsided anymore. I want it to feel equal, even if it can't be exactly the same." I listened as he explained how he'd been reading about boundaries, about how money and family often create invisible power dynamics. "I know I push those boundaries," he admitted, "and I think I need to show you that I can respect them now." That afternoon, instead of drifting into old patterns, we set some new ones. We agreed on alternating who paid for our outings. We talked about calling each other just because, not only when something was wrong, and we promised to be honest when we felt hurt, rather than letting resentment fester in silence. The following weekend, He surprised me again this time by inviting me to his apartment for dinner. I'd been curious to see the place but hadn't wanted to intrude. When I walked in, I was greeted by the smell of garlic and rosemary. Michael was in the kitchen, apron on, a pot of pasta simmering on the stove. "I even made dessert," he announced proudly, gesturing toward a small chocolate cake, cooling on the counter. The evening was simple but perfect. We ate, laughed, and lingered over coffee, talking about everything from old family vacations to books we'd both read. There was no tension, no undercurrent of unspoken grievances. Just two people, connected by love and history, learning to appreciate each other in a new way. As I left that night, I realized something important. The turning point in our relationship hadn't been one big moment, but a series of small choices. Choices to listen, to adjust, to meet each other halfway. I thought back to that painful Christmas dinner and the months of silence that followed. At the time, it had felt like the end of something, but now, I could see it had been the beginning of a necessary transformation. Michael wasn't the same as he'd been before, and neither was I. We'd both grown, not in spite of the conflict, but because of it. And as I walked to my car under the soft glow of the streetlights, I knew this was what I'd wanted all along. Not control, not repayment, but a relationship built on mutual respect and genuine care. Something we could both carry forward, stronger than before. I just want to check if you're still listening. If so, please type a 1-inch the comments. And if you feel a connection to my story, I'd be so grateful if you would like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell to stay updated. It was late summer when the true test came. The days were still long, but the air had taken on a faint crispness, a quiet reminder that change was coming. Michael called one Wednesday evening, his voice carrying a tone I recognized immediately, the one he used when he was trying to sound calm but was, in fact, anything but. "Mom, I hate to even bring this up, but my car broke down today," he said. "The mechanic says the transmission's shot. I can't afford to fix it right now." My heart sank. This was exactly the kind of situation that, in the past, would have sent us spiraling back into old habits. Him asking for help, me feeling pressured to rescue him. Resentment, building quietly under the surface. I could almost hear the echo of the Christmas night argument in my head, but Michael didn't stop there. "I'm not asking you to pay for it," he added quickly, as if he knew I was bracing for it. "I've been saving a little, and I've got some overtime coming up. I don't know how I'm going to get to work in the meantime." That pause, that moment when he admitted the problem, but didn't demand a solution, told me more about his growth than any speech could. "Okay," I said slowly. "Let's think this through. Maybe we can figure out a short-term plan together." We talked through options. He could take the bus, though it would mean waking up earlier. He could carpool with a coworker for a few days a week. Eventually, I offered to lend him my old sedan for 2 weeks, on the condition that he return it in good shape and with a full tank. His gratitude was immediate and sincere. "Thanks, Mom. I'll make it work. I promise." Over the next couple of weeks, I watched him keep that promise. He was careful with the car. He kept me updated on the repair progress. And true to his word, when he brought the car back, it was spotless inside and out. There was even a fresh bouquet of flowers on the passenger seat. "This is for letting me borrow it," he said, smiling a little sheepishly, "and for trusting me." That gesture, simple as it was, meant the world to me. Trust had been a fragile thing between us for a long time, easily cracked by unspoken assumptions and unmet expectations. But now, it felt like we were both tending to it like a shared garden, watering it, protecting it from weeds, giving it space to grow. A week later, Michael called again, Not because something was wrong, but just to share some good news. Got my car back, he said. And I paid for it in full. No loans, no credit cards. Just my own money. I couldn't stop the smile from spreading across my face. I'm proud of you, Michael. Really proud. As we talked, I realized this was more than a repaired car, it was proof. Proof that the boundaries we'd set weren't just holding. They were helping him stand taller, handle his own setbacks, and still come to me without fear of judgment. And for me, it was proof that letting go, truly letting go, had been the right choice. That night, as I sat on the porch, watching the last of the summer light fade, I felt an unexpected peace settle over me. We had been tested, and we'd come through, not untouched, but stronger. It wasn't marked by a party or a dramatic announcement. There were no balloons, no champagne, no family gathered around to witness it. The victory, when it came, was quiet, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't living inside it. It arrived in small ways. The first time Michael called just to share that he'd landed a new client at work. The afternoon he stopped by unannounced, not because he needed anything, but because he'd baked too much banana bread and thought I might like some. The day he asked for my opinion on something, not my permission or my wallet. These were the moments I held on to. One Sunday, in early autumn, we took a walk in the park. The air was crisp, the leaves crunching beneath our feet, in shades of gold and crimson. Michael had brought a thermos of coffee for us to share, a detail that might have seemed trivial, but I knew better. It meant he'd thought ahead. It meant he'd considered me. As we walked, he talked about a few challenges he'd been facing at work, a difficult coworker, a tight deadline, and how he was managing them. I noticed how often he used the word I instead of you, not in a selfish way, but in a self-reliant way. I've been thinking, he said at one point, that I don't want to go back to how things were. I like feeling like I can handle stuff. I mean, it's not easy, but it feels better than depending on someone else all the time. I glanced at him, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't see the boy who once leaned so heavily on me. I saw the man he was becoming. That's the thing about independence, I said. It's hard. But once you have it, it's yours. No one can take it away. He smiled at that, and we kept walking in comfortable silence. Later, back at my house, I took out an old photo album. Inside was a picture of Michael as a child, standing on his own for the first time, without holding my hand. He couldn't have been more than 2 years old, but the determination on his face was the same one I saw in him now. Some things never change, I said, showing him the photo. You've always been braver than you think. He studied the picture for a moment before laughing softly. Guess I just needed a reminder. That evening, after he left, I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window. The streetlights cast a soft glow on the quiet road outside, and I thought about how different things felt now. There was no tension in my chest when I thought of Michael. No nagging worry about the next crisis, or the next awkward conversation about money. Instead, there was trust, there was respect, and there was a kind of love that had weathered enough storms to know it could survive whatever came next. It wasn't the kind of victory you could post on social media or announce at a dinner party, but it was the kind that mattered most, the kind you felt in the ease of your own heart, in the calm of your own home, the kind where you knew you had done the hard work, and it had paid off, even if no one else saw it. And that, I decided, was worth more than any grand gesture could ever be. I just want to check if you're still listening. If so, please type a 1-inch the comments. And if you feel a connection to my story, I'd be so grateful if you would like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell to stay updated. It was a quiet Thursday evening. When the last word came, though, at the time, I didn't know it would feel like a closing chapter. I had just settled into my chair with a book when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Michael. "Dinner at my place tomorrow?" "I'm cooking," I smiled. It wasn't unusual anymore for him to invite me over, but something about the wording, short, confident, with no hesitation, made me curious. The next evening, I drove to his apartment. The late autumn air was cool, carrying the smell of wood smoke from somewhere nearby. When I knocked, the door swung open to the warm scent of roasted chicken and herbs. Michael was at the stove, sleeves rolled up, grinning. "Perfect timing," he said. "The chicken's resting. Wine's on the counter. Help yourself." We sat down at the table, nothing fancy. Just roast chicken, vegetables, and a loaf of crusty bread. But it was the conversation that mattered. We talked about my garden, about a book he'd just finished, about plans for the holidays. There was no strain, no subtext, no unspoken resentments lingering between us. Halfway through dessert, a simple apple crumble, Michael set down his fork and leaned back in his chair. "Mom," he began, "I've been meaning to tell you something." I braced myself, but his tone was calm. "You were right," he said. "Back then, when you started setting boundaries, I hated it at first. I felt like you were shutting me out. But now I get it. You weren't cutting me off. You were teaching me how to stand on my own. I didn't see it then, but I see it now." For a moment I couldn't speak. His words hung in the air, rich and heavy with meaning. "I didn't do it to hurt you," I finally said. "I did it because I knew you could be more. And because I wanted us to have the kind of relationship where we choose each other, not where one of us feels trapped by the other's needs." "Huh." Michael nodded slowly. "I think we're there now." There was nothing grand or cinematic about the moment. No sweeping background music. No tears streaming down our faces. Just two people, a mother and a son, sitting across from each other and recognizing how far they'd come. Later, as I was leaving, he handed me a small envelope. "Don't open it until you get home," he said with a sly smile. When I did, I found a simple card inside. On the front, in his handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for letting me grow up." I sat in my living room with that card in my hands, the lamplight soft and golden around me, and I realized this was the real ending. Not because everything was perfect. Life doesn't work that way. But because we had arrived at a place of mutual respect, trust, and choice. The boundaries were still there, but they no longer felt like walls. They were the framework of something stronger, something we had built together. And as I tucked the card into the drawer where I kept my most cherished keepsakes, I thought, if this is where we are now, then every hard conversation, every silent month, every painful lesson was worth it. The last word wasn't mine or his, it was ours. And it said, "We made it."